Hello, I'm Roy Jenkins. Welcome to All Things Considered, where today we meet a woman who first felt called to the Christian ministry when she was 16, had to wait for ordination until she was 60, retired at 80, was still preaching into her 90s, and has just celebrated her 100th birthday. It's a remarkable story, which we tell shortly. Many thanks. If you've just joined us, you're listening to All Things Considered here on BBC Radio Wales. While the ordination of women still provokes controversy in some quarters, the argument has long been over for the Reverend Peggy Newell Lewis. She was convinced that she should be ordained from the age of 16, waited until she was 60 to become a pastor, and went on preaching into her late 90s. And she's just celebrated her 100th birthday. The widow of a headmaster, Peggy Newell Lewis is a former magistrate and teacher of speech, and she's spent all her life in Six Bells, Abertillery. It was there that Bethany Baptist Church enabled her to fulfil that dream, and it was there that she helped to minister to some of the families bereaved by the disaster at the Arrol Griffin Colliery, which took 45 lives in 1960. We met her at her home just a few hundred yards from the chapel and the pit, and began by talking about the community she grew up in.
Abertillery was the centre of the valleys and everything. They used to come by train from Nantaglow, Brimau down to the Beaumarchais and the Pond in shops. Huge department stores, you know. That was the sort of town that Abertillery was. It was the centre. Because there were the pits and the steelworks and there were 10 shops in Six Bells. It was all so thriving until the collieries closed and the steelworks closed and all that, and depression descended on the whole place, with men standing on the corners idle because they couldn't get any work. People were generally depressed because, you see, there wasn't much money and there wasn't all these funds that are going now. They had very, very little money. And people helped each other, but you'd see the men there with patches on their trousers and that sort of thing. I remember when I was in school and I went upstairs to put a certain pair of shoes on, and I said, "Oh, where are my brown shoes, Mama?" I said, "Oh, I gave them to Megan across the road because she didn't have any shoes to wear. You can put your best ones on, darling." You know, that sort of thing. Everybody helping out. It was a wonderful spirit. My father was working all the time, and I used to have to go on the train to Blaenau and take a 10-shilling note and a bottle of food and something for somebody else, and sharing. So that at the end of it, everybody was in the same boat.
Tell me about church. What's your first memory of chapel?
Oh, I've taken to King Street when I was a baby.
That's the Baptist chapel.
Yes,
Yep.
King Street Baptist, yes, when I was a baby. I remember my mother standing by her knee in the chair, and she had on her lap one of the big Bibles, the family Bibles that we used to have with the clasp. And she'd opened it and all these beautiful photographs would be in there, you know, and she'd explain the story of all those that were in the Bible. And I particularly remember Solomon holding the baby. Vivid memories of that. And then as I grew up, of course, I was in the Sunday school. As I got a bit bigger, I used to sit by the side of the organ upstairs. And many a time I went to sleep up there by that organ. I remember that, yes. And of course the churches were full in those days. Absolutely full. You had to be early to get a seat sometimes. Particularly if there was a special preacher.
What was it that brought the people to the chapels then?
Well, tradition. I think people came because it was a thing to do, and you were considered to be respectable if you went to chapel. But you see, things have changed now. There's been a great weeding out by God. And the people who go to chapel now are those who want to go. The numbers are less, but they are real people now who really want to go and worship God in his own house.
But some people would say, well, actually, the churches were a lot healthier then when you were growing up, not only because there were far more people in them, but because they were much livelier, they had a lot more going on, and in many respects there was a great more depth. You
No, I
don't think
don't
that's
agree
true?
with that. I don't agree with that. I think there's much more depth now, much more, because people ask questions now. They didn't. They never. But now people put their minds to bear on their religion, and they ask searching questions, and we're seeking to know what is God's will all the time.
How important was faith in your life?
It was the main thing. I mean, I grew up in the chapel, as I told you, and then went on, and by the time I was 16, then I was baptised. And then I felt this call. And I went to the minister of the day, Reverend Reeves it was. And of course, it was an unheard of thing for a woman to go into the ministry or anything like that. And I can see myself now looking up at this tall man saying, I want to be a minister. And he just patted my head and smiled and walked away. And that was it. But not as far as I was concerned, because that longing remained. Although I went on then in my life doing all sorts of things.
This sense that this was something that you ought to be doing,
Yeah,
had to do,
yeah.
it never really went away.
Never, ever. No, it didn't. It was after I was married that I then started doing a lot of dramatics. I showed such a talent, I say this humbly, that people were urging me to take it up professionally, you know. But it wasn't what I wanted. And then after that, Reverend Hughes and Auntie Glow heard me adjudicating. And he said to me, have you ever tried preaching? And I said, well, no, I haven't. He said, well, I want you to come and take our women's meeting. He said, I've been a member.
So how old were you then?
About 27, 28, something like that. And from that, I decided then I must prepare myself, like Paul, before he preached. So I wrote to London Baptist Association, and I said I wanted a course of study. 3 years I studied with them. And that, of course, I couldn't have a diploma because I hadn't been to college, but I'd done the course. So I was so pleased about that I'd done the course. I started preaching, and to my great surprise, I was invited all around and all over the place. But never once did they ever suggest that I be their pastor.
Now, you were in Abertillery in Six Bells at the time of the Six Bells
Yeah,
disaster, 1960
yeah,
exactly,
yes.
46 years ago
Oh,
now.
yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What were you doing then?
Oh, well, then I was the only woman minister in the area. I mean, I visited all the people who were affected, and not all of them, of course, some of them. And I was the only woman minister up in the churchyard. Oh, I'll never forget that time. I remember standing up in the bedroom, it was high up, and we could see right across the valley to the head of the colliery there, where all the miners in their black clothes had assembled, ready to follow the hearses, you know. And my mother said to me, oh, you can't go, can you, darling? And I said, yes, I will, because God will be with me. And I went. And we had to stand at certain places in the churchyard, and the funerals were brought to us, you see. And I remember standing up there looking down on Cemetery Road, and hearse after hearse after hearse coming up there, you know. Oh, it was awful. It was a terrible, terrible time. But the feeling of the people at that time, they were so kind to each other. There was such love pouring out for everybody. And those poor people who had suffered were so helped by everybody. It was a remarkable time. It was an unbelievable time.
Now, you were a rare creature as a woman minister. Did you experience any significant resistance to your being a
Never.
minister?
I can honestly say I never had any prejudice at all. Never. But I
No.
was preaching once a man got up and he said, I don't think women should be in the pulpit, he said. But Paul said, women should, so on and so on.
Women should keep silent.
Yeah, and I said, that's what Paul said. I don't listen to everything that Paul says. I listen to what the Lord says. And the Lord said, we are all equal in his sight. I shut up. So that was my attitude, and that is my attitude today. Why shouldn't God call women as well as men? Why not? And you see, sometimes you find that even men find it easier to talk of their troubles to a woman. They've talked to their mothers. They find it easier to talk to a woman. I'm full of such secret, I could set 6 bells on fire. That they beat a path to my door just to tell their stories.
When you were still wanting to be a minister, even though you were a
Yeah.
young girl in the 20s, in the
Yeah.
30s, did you feel that because you were frustrated in that direction, then perhaps you should be radical in other directions? I mean, did this ever take political expression for you? Did you start standing up for women's rights generally?
Never. No, nothing like that. I'm not a political animal at all. No. I just had this hunger, this longing, this wishing that it would be, and praying about it all the time. And then at last, you see, I was praying now, dear God, if you don't want me to be a minister, please take this hunger out of my heart. And it was some months after I called to Bethany. The deacon had asked me to come and see them. And I went in, and the first thing they said was, Mrs. Lewis, we've asked you to come because we want you to be our minister. And I literally saw stars. I did. And I said, at last those words have been spoken. When I went outside, my husband was in the car, and he was with me in everything, supportive in every way. I sat by the side of the car and I said, do you know they've asked me to be their minister? Oh, if you won't, will you, he said. And I sat back and I thought, oh God, I'm not going to be able to be a minister after all. And then we went home. My father was long dead. My mother was ill in bed. And I went upstairs and she said, what do they want? So I said, they have asked me to be their minister. Don't, darling, she said. Don't, darling. They'll break your heart. That's it. So I didn't sleep at all. I didn't speak about it at all after. But when Lou came home from school in the lunchtime, I can see him now. He stood with his back to the kitchen door. And he said, darling, I've been thinking, if God has called you to Bethany, we can't say no. So I flew upstairs to my mother and I told her what Lou had said. And she said, and I think the same, darling. I've been thinking about it all night. So that was it, you see.
And you were pastor at Bethany for 20 years.
Yeah.
You were 60 when you went there. You were 80 some odd when you finished.
80.
That's amazing. I mean, what did you see yourself doing then? Because, I mean, 60 is the age that a lot of people are talking about retirement these days. A lot of people are retired. Well, I mean, what did you see your function as being?
Well, to get everybody in a real relationship with the Lord Jesus in any way that I could. Teaching, preaching, beseeching. That was the aim always. But I had rewards. God rewarded me because for the 6 months I was there, I had 6 baptisms, you see, and 2 young men went for the ministry. Yes, so you see, there was that, and it was wonderful. I could hardly believe it. Oh God, how wonderful you are, I thought. You know?
Looking back over your years of ministry, both the 20 years you spent at Bethany as the pastor and in the many years you spent as a speaker and a lay preacher and all the rest of it, what's given you most joy?
I always felt when I went up into the pulpit, a great feeling of responsibility. Here I am, Christ's messenger, and every word that I say, it must be satisfactory to him. So I went up into the pulpit always in fear and trembling. I never took it for granted. Never, ever. It was too important to me for that. I felt it so deeply. The day I was ordained was the most joyful day I could ever have in my life. The joy of ministering to people in the name of the Lord. That joy, that satisfaction, that feeling of having brought some comfort in his name to people. That's the most joyful thing. That's the most rewarding thing.
Reverend Peggy Newell Lewis just turned 100. Many thanks for welcoming us.
Thank you so very much for coming. It's been a joy to talk to you.
I'm Roy Jenkins, the producer was Lisa Hawkins. Join us again next week for another edition of All Things Considered. And don't forget that if you want to hear the programme again, you can download us at bbc.co.uk/Radio Wales.